Ladies and gentlemen, for the first time ever at San Diego ComicCon, please welcome three-time Oscar winner Oliver Stone.
Oliver, when you envision this moment, walking out here on the stage, and then when you think about what just happened, did they line up, your expectations and the reality?
Yes. No, it was nice. It's nice to see a memory, history. I'm a fan of history.
Good. Well, speaking of being a fan of history, we're here to talk about your new film, Snowden. And listen, you're known as being someone who likes to tackle politics in your films and to tackle conspiracies in your films. Do you feel like the story that you tell in Snowden, given it talks about the fact that the government may have been surveilling all of us, this isn't about one person being assassinated or one person being elected, do you feel like this is the ultimate conspiracy story for you to take on?
I hope not, but if there's larger ones, I think we're going to have to go back into it. But right now, this is Snowden is a larger-than-life story of what's happening right now under our noses and continuing to happen. And it affects the majority of you, this audience, into this next generation.
The story of Edward Snowden has been well told. There's been countless interviews, articles. There was a great documentary called Citizen4. What did you want to add to the story of him with this film?
Well, he's still a mystery. We went as far as we could. He cooperated with us. We went over there several times. We went by the public record. There was a wonderful book written by the Guardian journalists, and I spoke to the journalists who were there with him in Hong Kong, and as many people who would talk to me, including the lawyer who was in Hong Kong. So we got as far as we could, whether, we leave it to the realm of dramatization. This is what we had to do. We had to, there are things that we don't know, and things that he will one day, hopefully, reveal in a book of his own.
What conversations did you actually have to have, if any, with Edward Snowden to get his blessing and his permission?
And over the period of, let's say, three more meetings until May, it was cat and mouse, getting to know him trusting this process. He was not particularly interested in a movie, but as the months went by and we got to know each other better, and I brought in a co-writer who he very much liked, Kieran Fitzgerald. It came together in May, June of that year, and then we wrote it and went to work. The screenplay was a nightmare of complication, how to simplify it, how to keep it interesting, make it exciting, a thriller. And by February of the next year, we were shooting, and we kept revising the screenplay through the process of shooting, into the editing, in fact, as I tend to do.
Did you get the sense in your conversations with Ed that he was very familiar with your work, a little bit familiar with your work, or not at all familiar with your work?
I can't tell. He'd seen part of history, Untold History of the United States, was a documentary, and been apparently impressed with it. And, he's very inner, lives on the computer. I met him all the time under conditions of secrecy. And I found him to be going through a painful period, and I found him to be very resolute and very strong. You realize he was only 29 years old when he did this enormous thing, and it takes, at 29, I could never even come close to imagining it. But he's paid for it in a big way, and I've seen him over a period of almost 2 years now, and he's never wilted in the face of the opposition. He's gotten stronger, and he stays very much in touch with the reform movement on surveillance, with many contacts in Europe and the United States and Asia, and he talks to them consistently.
And my understanding is that this was not an easy project to get funded. Why was it so hard to get money for this?
You tell me, Dave. It was, frankly, it was turned down by every major studio. The script was good, the budget was good, cast was good. It was definitely, what you call it, self-censorship. I don't believe there was an enemy such as the NSA lurking in the background, no. I don't. But definitely self-censorship is a huge issue in this country, and it blocks so much of the truth from coming out. And every studio, every corporate board that runs the studio, more than the studio people, said no. And it was hard. We went, France, Germany were the major contributors, as well as Open Road, which is bringing the film to the United States, which is a fine distributor. It had Spotlight last year.
First of all, the busiest man at 2016 San Diego Comic-Con, Zachary Quinto. Shailene Woodley. And Joseph Gordon-Levitt. Joe, this way. Come closer.
Hi, everybody.
Hello.
Joe, let's explain the choice of T-shirt today.
Sure. Well, a word that gets brought up in these conversations a lot is the word patriot. And I think actually I'm sitting next to one of the most patriotic filmmakers in the history of American cinema. And that's a lot to do with what this story is about, because being a patriot in the United States, to me, is not just about unquestioningly saying that everything is good. If you love something and you see something wrong about it, you raise your hand and you talk about it and you try to fix it. And that's what I think his movies have done for decades. And I was really proud to be invited into one of his films.
Joe, I've seen the movie, and it's so impressive. And it sounds trivial and small, but I think the voice of Ed Snowden, the actual voice, is such an important thing because we've heard it, all of us, so many times in interviews. How did you get to a point where you felt like you had nailed it?
Well, thanks. I ripped a bunch of audio off of Citizen 4, the documentary you mentioned earlier, as well as lots of interviews and stuff, and just put it in headphones and on repeat. But I remember the day early on when we recorded first some temporary voiceover, and there's a certain threshold sometimes you cross. You're like kind of working on a voice, but I didn't want to try to do it in rehearsals because you don't want to do it halfway. And the first time I think you really heard me try to do it all the way, we were recording this temporary voiceover, and he can be very subtle. He was like, "Oh, you sound like him," and I was like, "That's a big compliment from Oliver." And yeah.
Shailene, you have become very politically active in the last couple of years. What came first? Your interest in politics as they are today, this film, did one kind of lead to the other?
I wouldn't say one necessarily led to the other. I actually have never been very politically active before this election. But this movie, I mean, I found out that they were making it, and I wanted to, first and foremost, just thank Oliver for making this movie. I remember, it's so important and it's so relevant, and being someone I was in my early 20s when Ed released all of this information and he did what he did, it had a profound impact on my life. For someone to be brave in his intent to educate people, regardless of whether you agree with it or not, to release information that he felt was going to empower people to know what was going on behind the scenes. It's something that, you kind of always suspected. You was always joking around, like, I wonder if they're watching us. And then to have it sort of confirmed like that, it really opened my eyes to policy in a way that I'd never thought about before.
You didn't think the reason that you couldn't get money for this was because of the NSA. But the fact is, you did decide to shoot this film not in the United States. You shot it internationally. What was the reasoning behind that? Were you at all afraid that there would be some people looking at you, checking in on what you were doing?
I just don't want to have confusion arise in case they did not interfere with us. And I have no knowledge or suspicion that they did. Foreman, our producer, wanted to go to Germany. He's Germany. And he knew we had subsidies waiting for us there and a friendly climate. Look what they've been through since World War II, the Stasi. They had a respect for privacy really strong, and they're big supporters of Snowden. So we went there, French money and German money. But I don't know the answer. Do you have an idea, Joe?
Of why we shot in Germany instead of the U.S.?
I'm talking about what he asked about the NSA.
About surveillance? I mean, I agree with you. I don't think that the NSA is necessarily proactively trying to stop us from making a movie. It's something more kind of complicated and subtle than that, and it's what Oliver's talking about is I really value being alone sometimes. I get a lot of thinking done when I can, talk out loud and know that no one can hear me. And that's, I think, important. It's an important part of being a human being. And I know not everyone feels that way. I know some people really don't care whether they have moments of privacy, and I respect that as well. To me, the question is not whether you need privacy or you don't need privacy. The question is that we're promised privacy in the Constitution, and if the government was going to change those rules, then they have to be open about that. And that to me is actually even more important than the questions of privacy or mass surveillance in the Snowden story, is a question of government transparency. We can have an open debate. Some people will think that we should have mass surveillance. Some people will think that we shouldn't. That's what a democracy's supposed to be, is we're all supposed to have that conversation and decide together. The problem was that decision wasn't made out in the open. The rules were broken kind of in secret and then lied about, and no one could prove that there were lies going on until Edward Snowden provided that evidence.
I'm assuming all three of you met the... Yeah. All three of you met the people you play in real life? And if so, what were those meetings like, and what did you glean? Shay?
I met Lindsay Mills, Ed's girlfriend, when we were filming in Washington, D.C., about 3/4 of the way through the movie. And it was an interesting experience. I've never played anyone who was a real person, let alone still alive today. And I felt a certain pressure when we started. We sort of based the character around what we knew from her past social media sightings and things that we knew about her career life. But in a lot of ways, Oliver and I had to come up with who she was outside of who she actually is, because I didn't know her. And when I met her, I remember thinking, dang, I wish I had met her beforehand, because there was small mannerisms or there was quirks that make her unique and make her who she is that I would have implemented into the movie. But it was a trippy experience. For me, I wanted her approval. I wanted her to know that I was trying everything I could to pay homage to who she is as an individual, and just kind of pray that I did a good job at it.
Joe? And I'm also curious, logistically, how does one get to meet Edward Snowden? What do you have to do to be in the same room with him?
Well, I went to Moscow. Oliver and Kieran, the co-writer, and I all went to Moscow. And I got to sit with Ed, and Lindsay actually was there also. For 4 hours. We sat and talked for hours, and I wanted to just kind of understand who he was. We got to sit down and have a meal. I think you can tell a lot about a person just by how they are when you sit and eat with them. And he's very polite, was one of the first things I noticed. He's from North Carolina, and I think that's actually really charming. He's very much kind of an old-fashioned gentleman almost in that way. Really warm, and an optimist. That's the other thing that's, I think, really funny is, he's sort of known for raising his hand about some of the downsides of what technology can be. He's actually extremely optimistic about technology in the future and how technology can improve democracy and improve, the state of the human race. And I love talking about the future. So we had a really good time.
One thing I found so fascinating about it is I knew nothing really about his personal life. I didn't know he suffered from epileptic seizures, which we learn in the film. I didn't really know much about the relationship between Lindsay and Ed. For the three of you, Oliver and Joe and Shay, was that something that was particularly interesting to explore, given that it was something that many people don't know?
For me, it was crucial, and we put an emphasis on it in the script, because without Lindsay in his life, it's all, he doesn't have any friends. He really doesn't, and he's not close to his sister, he's not close to his mother or father. So he lives in this world of a computer world, inside that, and I think that's his link to the rest of us, and I think that's the reason, one of the main reasons, besides the epilepsy and various things that happen in the movie, one of the main reasons he did this radical action.
What about you two?
I thought it was interesting because we all know the narrative of Edward Snowden as mass media wants us to know the narrative of Edward Snowden. And I felt like the opportunity to know him as a human being, to know him outside of his policy, outside of his job, outside of his headlines, was crucial, because it's really easy to forget that people who make decisions they make are still human, they're emotional creatures, and they still experience a human life. And Lindsay was a big part of that in our dialogues and our talking with one another. You see a certain side of someone when you see them in love, when you see them in a relationship, and I felt like that was an important piece to share with the world of who Ed is.
I just wanted to say about Shailene that she wrote me a letter. I didn't know her, and she wrote me a letter filled with emotion, really coming off the page. And that's when I saw Fault in Our Stars, which I very much enjoy. Her performance in that movie is notable, and she moves the audience. It touches something in everyone, I think. And she came to this film and she brought that abundance of emotion. I'm very grateful for it. I wanted to footnote that. I do think we represent, maybe not to their satisfaction, but much of the government's position. We represent it in certain characters who speak in a certain way, defending this program. So we don't want to take sides on this in the movie. And I think you have to see the movie to understand the positions. The third class of people, it's the NSA people. Ed told us he feels that they're obviously going to hate the movie, but he thinks that it's a seed, and many people feel more in the middle than you think about what they're doing. And that's a very interesting point of view, that people can change over the course of a month, a year, 2 years. They'll come this way.
There's 7 words that flash near the end of the trailer that have been used, all of them, to describe Edward Snowden. Many of them are factual. He was a soldier. We see that in the film. He is a fugitive. I want to ask you, the 4 of you, about 3 of those words in that trailer that are up for debate. And I want the 4 of you to raise your hand if you think these words actually apply to Edward Snowden. I have a feeling I know how this is going to go. Patriot. Raise your hand if that applies to Edward Snowden. I agree with you. 4 for 4. Traitor. 0 for 4. And finally, hero. Yeah. 4 for 4. Well, this movie comes out on September 16th, and I encourage you all to see it because it's going to make you think. And I thank all 4 of you for making us think today. So Oliver Stone, Joseph Gordon-Levitt, Shailene Woodley, and Zachary Quinto. Thanks everybody. Have a great Comic-Con.